The first gunshot was what brought Thomas O'Malley and Charlotte Larson together, though neither of them knew it at the time. The year was 1872, and Idaho City was barely clinging to life after the gold rush had swept through, leaving behind only the most stubborn, the most desperate, or the most visionary of souls. Thomas fell into all three categories, having arrived 6 months earlier with nothing but the clothes on his back, a dead man's pocket watch, and a determination that could move mountains, or at least, he hoped, enough earth to find gold where others had given up looking. Blood trickled between his fingers as he gripped his shovel tighter. The late August sun beat down mercilessly on his back as he continued to dig, his hands raw and blistered from weeks of relentless work. The shot had come from town, probably another drunken miner or a dispute at the saloon. He barely registered it anymore. Violence was as much a part of Idaho territory as the mountains and the dust. "You're bleeding again," said Jeb. His only employee, though employee was a generous term for a man who worked for the promise of a percentage of gold they had yet to find. "It'll stop," Thomas replied, not bothering to look at his torn palms. He'd been working this claim for 4 months now, and each day brought him closer to proving his father wrong. "No son of mine will ever amount to anything but trouble," the old man had said before Thomas left Boston. He'd show him. He'd show everyone. Jeb shook his head. "You're going to work yourself to death before you strike anything. Then I'll die trying. Suit yourself. I'm heading into town for supplies." Jeb tossed his tool aside. "You should come. Get those hands looked at." Thomas just grunted and kept digging. He didn't stop until the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley. His stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten since dawn. With a sigh, he finally set the shovel down and examined his hands. The skin was split open across both palms, blood mixed with dirt creating a grotesque pattern. He tried to flex his fingers and winced. He'd have to ride into Idaho City after all. He needed bandages at the very least, and his food supplies were running low. Reluctantly, he covered the day's work, gathered his meager belongings, and mounted his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Copper. Idaho City was hardly more than a collection of wooden buildings strung along a muddy main street. Once home to thousands during the boom years, its population had dwindled to a few hundred stubborn souls. Still, it had what Thomas needed: a general store, a doctor when necessary, and a saloon where a man could get a hot meal without questions. As he rode past the scattered buildings, he noticed an unfamiliar wagon parked outside Doc Mitchell's place. A woman was unloading crates from it, her movements deliberate and efficient. Thomas wouldn't have paid her much mind. New faces came and went in mining towns, but something about her posture, straight-backed and determined, caught his eye. He dismounted in front of the general store, wincing as his hands protested the movement. He'd buy bandages first, then maybe stop at the saloon for a quick meal before heading back to his claim. He couldn't afford to waste time in town. The bell jangled as he pushed open the door. Mr. Peterson, the shopkeeper, looked up from his ledger. "Evening, O'Malley. Haven't seen you in a spell. Been busy." Thomas laid his bloody hands on the counter. "Need bandages." Peterson whistled. "Need more than bandages, I'd say. Doc's got a new assistant, just arrived yesterday. Might want to have her take a look at those." "Just the bandages," Thomas insisted. He didn't have money to waste on doctors. The shopkeeper shrugged and gathered the supplies. As Thomas fumbled with his coins, the door opened again, and the woman he'd seen by the wagon entered. "Mr. Peterson, Doc Mitchell asked if you had any more of that." She stopped when she saw Thomas's hands. Good heavens! Thomas turned, irritated at being the center of attention, and found himself looking into the clearest blue eyes he'd ever seen. The woman was perhaps 25, with chestnut hair pulled back in a practical bun. She wore a simple blue dress with the sleeves rolled up to her elbows, revealing strong forearms that spoke of someone unafraid of work. "It's nothing," he muttered, trying to hide his hands. "Those aren't nothing," she said firmly, approaching him with the confidence of someone used to dealing with the wounded and stubborn. "I'm Charlotte Larson. I'm assisting Doc Mitchell. Let me see." Before Thomas could protest, she'd taken his hands in hers. Her touch was gentle but sure, turning his palms upward to examine the damage. "How long have you been working with these open wounds?" she asked, her tone professional, but with an undercurrent of concern that caught him off guard. "Few days," he lied. She raised an eyebrow. The infection suggests longer. You need these cleaned and properly dressed, or you'll risk blood poisoning. I've got bandages, he said, nodding toward his purchase. Bandages won't be enough. She looked up at him, and Thomas found himself unable to look away. These need to be cleaned thoroughly and treated. Come back to the doctor's office with me. I don't have time. You'll have even less time when you lose the use of your hands entirely, she interrupted. There was a steel in her voice that brooked no argument. Or would you prefer to explain to your boss why you can't work? I am the boss, Thomas said, a hint of pride creeping into his voice despite himself. Then you should know better. She released his hands and stepped back. I'll be at the doctor's office when you're ready to be sensible. With that, she turned to Peterson, completed her errand, and left the store without a backward glance. That's quite a woman, Peterson said with a chuckle. Doc found her in Boise. She trained as a nurse during the war. Thomas grunted and paid for his supplies. He should head back to his claim. Daylight was wasting, and gold didn't mine itself. But as he mounted Copper again, he found himself riding not toward his claim, but toward Doc Mitchell's office. He told himself it was just common sense. He couldn't work with useless hands. It had nothing to do with clear blue eyes or a voice that somehow cut through the haze of exhaustion that had been his constant companion for months. The doctor's office was a small cabin with a sign announcing Dr. J. Mitchell, physician and surgeon. Thomas tied Copper to the hitching post and hesitated before knocking. He could still turn around, head back to his claim. Before he could decide, the door opened, and Charlotte stood there, as if she'd been expecting him. I knew you'd come to your senses, she said, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Come in. The office was sparse but clean. A desk stood in one corner, an examination table in another, and shelves of bottles and medical implements lined the walls. Doc's out on a call, she explained, guiding him to a chair next to a small table. Sit. I'll get water and antiseptic. Thomas sat, feeling oddly out of place. He couldn't remember the last time he'd been inside a building that wasn't the general store or the saloon. Charlotte returned with a basin of water and various bottles. She pulled up a chair opposite him and held out her hands. Let me see. Reluctantly, Thomas placed his hands in hers. Her touch was cool against his hot skin. These are worse than I thought, she muttered, gently cleaning away the dirt and dried blood. How long have you really been working with these? Thomas winced as the cloth touched his raw flesh. Week, maybe more. She shook her head but didn't scold him. Instead, she worked methodically, cleaning each cut, applying antiseptic that stung like fire, and finally wrapping his hands in clean bandages. You need to keep these clean, she instructed, and you should rest them for a few days. Thomas snorted. Can't afford to rest. You can't afford not to, she countered. She hesitated, then added, Have you eaten today? The question caught him off guard. Was heading to the saloon after this. Charlotte stood and gathered the bloodied cloths. Wait here. She disappeared through a door at the back of the office, returning moments later with a steaming bowl of stew and a chunk of bread. It's not much, but it's better than whatever they're serving at the Wild Horse, she said, setting it before him. Eat. Those hands won't heal if you're half-starved. Thomas stared at the food, then at her. Why are you helping me? She shrugged. It's my job. Feeding strangers isn't part of a nurse's duties. Consider it payment for being a cooperative patient. She smiled, and something in Thomas's chest tightened. Eat. I need to inventory supplies. As she busied herself with the shelves, Thomas ate. The stew was simple but hearty, with chunks of beef and vegetables in a rich broth. It was the best meal he'd had in months, and he found himself scraping the bowl clean. When was the last time you had a proper meal? Charlotte asked, watching him from across the room. Define proper, he replied, breaking off another piece of bread. Something that wasn't jerky or beans cooked over a campfire. Thomas considered. Boston. About a year ago. Boston. She looked surprised. You're a long way from home. This is home now, he said firmly. Got a claim west of town. Going to strike it rich any day now. Charlotte's expression softened with something that might have been pity. Thomas immediately regretted sharing even that small bit of information. How much do I owe you? He asked, standing abruptly. For the medical treatment or the meal? There was a hint of amusement in her voice. Both. $2 for the bandages and medicine. The meal was free. Thomas dug into his pocket and placed the coins on the table. Thank you, Miss Larson. Charlotte, she corrected him. And you are? Thomas O'Malley. Well, Mr. O'Malley, I expect to see you back here in 3 days to check those hands. Her tone made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. I'll be busy. He worked till his hands bled. She said they'll heal, but only if you stop for supper. Charlotte quoted with a small smile. I've seen your type before, Mr. O'Malley. Men who think they can outwork their own bodies. You can't, and I won't have you undoing my handiwork because you're too stubborn to take care of yourself. Thomas found himself speechless. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had spoken to him like that, as if his well-being mattered. 3 days, she repeated. And if you don't come to me, I'll come looking for you. He had no doubt she would. 3 days, he agreed, and let himself out into the gathering dusk. As he rode back to his claim, Thomas told himself the warm feeling in his chest was just from a hot meal. It had nothing to do with blue eyes and gentle hands and a voice that somehow made him feel seen for the first time in years. 3 days later, Thomas returned to Doc Mitchell's office as promised, though he'd never intended to. He'd gone back to work the very next day, trying to be more careful with his bandaged hands. But Charlotte's words kept echoing in his mind, and when the third day came, he found himself riding into town despite his better judgment. Charlotte was alone again when he arrived, sorting medicines on the shelves. She turned at his entrance, and the smile that lit her face sent an unexpected jolt through him. You came, she said, sounding genuinely pleased. I was preparing arguments to convince you when I had to track you down. I'm a man of my word, Thomas replied, taking off his hat. Sit. Let me see those hands. He obeyed, watching as she unwrapped the bandages. Her face was focused, professional, but there was a softness around her eyes that hadn't been there during their first meeting. You've been working, she accused, examining the new calluses forming over his partially healed wounds. Can't afford not to. You can't afford to lose your hands either. She sighed, applying fresh salve to the healing cuts. The infection's clearing, at least. As she worked, Thomas found himself studying her face. There were freckles scattered across her nose, and a small scar near her right temple. She caught him looking and raised an eyebrow. Something on my face, Mr. O'Malley? Thomas, he corrected, then immediately felt foolish. Just wondering what brings a Boston-trained nurse to Idaho territory. Charlotte's hands stilled for a moment. Who says I'm from Boston? Your accent. It's faint, but it's there. He'd recognized it immediately, that distinct New England cadence. I grew up there. She smiled, resuming her work. Very observant. Yes, I trained at Massachusetts General during the war. Afterward, I wanted something different. Something challenging. Idaho City is certainly that. Indeed. She finished bandaging his left hand and reached for his right. And what brought you west, Thomas? Gold fever like the rest. Something like that, he said evasively. Charlotte gave him a knowing look but didn't press. These are healing well, all things considered. Keep them clean and come back in another week. A week is a long time to be away from my claim. Consider it doctor's orders. She wrapped his right hand deftly. Are you hungry? I was about to have lunch. The invitation surprised him. I don't want to impose. It's not an imposition. Just some bread and cheese. Doc won't be back until evening house call out at the Reynolds farm. Thomas knew he should refuse. He had work to do, but the thought of riding back to his lonely claim, to another meal of beans and jerky, suddenly seemed unbearable. Thank you, he said. That would be nice. Charlotte's small kitchen behind the office was tidy and practical, with a cast-iron stove and a table with 2 chairs. She set out bread, cheese, and sliced apples with an efficiency that spoke of someone used to making do with little. It's not much, she apologized. It's a feast, Thomas assured her. The simple food tasted better than anything he could remember. As they ate, Charlotte told him about her work during the war, tending to wounded soldiers in overcrowded hospitals. After seeing so much death, I wanted to go somewhere where I could help build something new, she explained. Doc Mitchell was advertising for an assistant in Boise. He's getting older, needs help with his practice. Lucky for Idaho City, Thomas said. Then, impulsively, lucky for me. A faint blush colored her cheeks. And what's your story? You don't sound like a typical gold seeker. Thomas hesitated. He rarely spoke about his past, but something about Charlotte made him want to share. My father was a banker in Boston. Expected me to follow in his footsteps. I tried for years, but we never saw eye to eye on anything. He picked up an apple slice, studying it rather than meeting her gaze. After one fight too many, he told me I'd never amount to anything. So I left, decided to prove him wrong. By finding gold, by making my own way, being my own man. Thomas shrugged. Gold seemed as good a path as any. Charlotte regarded him thoughtfully. And has it been? A good path? The question caught him off guard. Had it been? Months of back-breaking labor, living in a tent, subsisting on the barest necessities, with nothing to show for it, but calloused hands and empty pockets. I haven't given up yet, he said finally. That wasn't my question. Her voice was gentle. Before Thomas could respond, the door to the office opened, and someone called Charlotte's name. Duty calls, she said, rising. You're welcome to finish eating. Thomas did, listening as she dealt with a miner who'd cut his arm on equipment. Her voice was calm and professional, soothing the man's pain with quiet competence. When she returned, Thomas had finished his meal and washed his plate. I should get back, he said, reaching for his hat. 1 week, Charlotte reminded him. And try to give those hands a rest when you can. Yes, madam, Thomas said, a smile tugging at his lips despite himself. As he rode back to his claim, he found himself counting the days until he'd see her again. The week passed slowly. Thomas tried to be more careful with his hands, wearing the gloves Charlotte had insisted he take. Each night, as he ate his solitary meal by the fire, he found himself thinking of her blue eyes, her capable hands, the way she didn't flinch from hard truths. He told himself it was foolishness. She was educated, refined beneath her practical exterior. He was a failed banker's son chasing an impossible dream in the dirt. Their paths had crossed by chance, nothing more. But when the week was up, he was the first customer at Doc Mitchell's door. This time, the doctor himself was present, a grizzled man in his 60s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. He examined Thomas's hands while Charlotte assisted. Miss Larson's done a fine job, he pronounced. Another week, and you'll be good as new. Though I'd suggest gloves in the future. Already insisted on that, Doc, Charlotte said, with a quick smile at Thomas. Good, good. Now if you'll excuse me, I need to check on Mrs. Wilson's new baby. The doctor patted Thomas's shoulder. You're in good hands with Miss Larson. When they were alone, Charlotte re-bandaged Thomas's hands with fresh dressings. These are healing nicely. You've been careful. Had a good teacher, Thomas replied, watching her work. When did you arrive in Idaho City? Before I saw you at the general store. Just the day before. I'd been in Boise for a month, waiting for Doc Mitchell's previous assistant to leave. She glanced up at him. Why do you ask? Thomas hesitated. There was a gunshot the day we met. In town. Did you hear about it? Charlotte's expression clouded. Yes. A dispute at the saloon. A man was killed. Was it your first? First what? First death in Idaho City. First time you heard gunfire and knew what it meant. She finished bandaging his right hand and sat back. Yes. Is it always like that here? Not always, but often enough. Thomas studied her face. Does it make you regret coming? No, she said firmly. There was violence in Boston too, just different kinds. At least here it's honest. She paused. Are you trying to scare me away, Thomas O'Malley? He smiled despite himself. Just making sure you know what you've gotten yourself into. I know exactly what I'm doing. She gathered up the used bandages. Will you stay for lunch again? It became a pattern. Every week, Thomas would ride into town. Charlotte would check his hands, which were healing well, and they would share a meal. Sometimes they ate at the doctor's office, sometimes at the small boarding house where Charlotte had a room. Once, Thomas even brought supplies from his camp, fresh rabbit he'd snared and wild onions he'd found growing near his claim. They talked about Boston and the war, about Idaho Territory and its harsh beauty, about books they'd read and places they'd seen. Thomas found himself looking forward to these conversations more than anything else in his life. For the first time in years, he felt truly alive in those hours with Charlotte, not just surviving. A month passed, then two. Thomas's hands healed completely, but still he came to town each week. His claim yielded nothing but disappointment, but he kept digging, driven now not just by determination to prove his father wrong, but by a new desire, to have something to show for himself, something that might impress a woman with clear blue eyes and a mind as sharp as her medical instruments. The seasons turned, autumn painting the mountains in fiery hues before giving way to the first dusting of snow. Thomas reinforced his tent against the coming winter, knowing he should consider more permanent shelter but unwilling to spare the time from his search for gold. One crisp November morning, as he was digging in a new section of his claim, his shovel struck something hard. Expecting another rock, he cleared away the dirt to find a gleaming vein of quartz shot through with unmistakable threads of gold. His heart pounding, he dug further, confirming what he'd first seen. He'd struck it. Not just a few flecks or nuggets, but a substantial vein that could yield enough gold to make him, if not rich, then comfortable enough to build a real life in Idaho City. His first thought was of Charlotte. He had to tell her. Had to show her that his stubborn persistence had finally paid off. He covered the find carefully, marking the spot, and rode into town at a gallop, ignoring the curious stares of the few people on the street. The doctor's office was empty when he arrived, the door locked. Frantic, he hurried to Charlotte's boarding house, only to be told by the landlady that both the doctor and his assistant had been called to a difficult berth at a farm several miles outside of town. They weren't expected back until the next day. Disappointment crashed over Thomas like a cold wave. He'd been so eager to share his news, to see Charlotte's face light up with pride and maybe something more. Now he'd have to wait. He was about to head back to his claim when a thought struck him. Maybe this was for the best. Instead of just telling Charlotte about his find, he could show her what it meant, what it could mean for both of them, if she felt even a fraction of what he felt for her. With renewed purpose, Thomas headed to the general store. He had plans to make and supplies to buy. When Charlotte returned, he'd be ready. 2 days later, Charlotte rode back into Idaho City tired but satisfied. The birth had been difficult but successful, mother and child both healthy despite the complications. All she wanted now was a hot bath and her own bed. As she approached the boarding house, she noticed a figure sitting on the porch steps. Thomas O'Malley rose as she dismounted, his face breaking into a smile that made her heart skip despite her exhaustion. "You're back," he said, stepping forward to take the reins of her horse. "How was the birth?" "Exhausting, but successful. What are you doing here?" It wasn't their usual day for meeting, and something about Thomas seemed different, a barely contained excitement vibrating beneath his usual, reserved demeanor. "I have something to show you," he said. "Can you come with me? Just for an hour or so?" Charlotte hesitated, fatigue pulling at her limbs. "I'm very tired, Thomas. Please." There was an urgency in his voice she'd never heard before. "It's important." Against her better judgment, Charlotte nodded. "Let me change clothes first." 20 minutes later, freshly washed and wearing a clean dress, Charlotte followed Thomas down Main Street. He led her not toward his claim as she'd expected, but to a small cabin on the edge of town. It was one of the older buildings, built during the gold rush's heyday, but recently repaired from the looks of it. Fresh caulking sealed the logs, and new glass gleamed in the windows. "Whose place is this?" Charlotte asked as Thomas opened the gate of the small fence surrounding the property. "Mine," he said, a hint of pride in his voice. "Or it will be, once the papers are finalized tomorrow." Charlotte stared at him in surprise. "You bought a house? But what about your claim?" "I struck gold," Thomas said simply. 3 days ago. A good vein, enough to buy this place and have a stake for the future." He hesitated, then added, "Come inside." Confused but curious, Charlotte followed him through the front door. The interior was simple but solid, a main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and 2 doors leading to what she assumed were bedrooms. Someone had been working here recently. The floors were swept, and a fire burned in the hearth, taking the chill off the autumn air. "It needs work," Thomas said, watching her face anxiously. "But the roof is sound, and the chimney draws well. There's a garden plot out back, and the well has good water." "It's lovely," Charlotte said, genuinely impressed. "But I don't understand. You've been so dedicated to your claim. Why buy a house in town now?" Thomas took a deep breath. "Because I realized something, digging in that cold earth day after day. Gold is just metal. It's what it can build that matters." He gestured around the cabin. "This matters. A home. A future." He stepped closer to her, his eyes intense. "When I first came to Idaho City, I was running from my past, trying to prove something to a man who probably isn't even thinking about me anymore. But these past few months, spending time with you, I've started to dream of something different. Something better. Charlotte's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. What are you saying, Thomas? I'm saying I love you, Charlotte Larson. I think I started falling for you the moment you scolded me about my bleeding hands. He smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. You were right, you know. They healed, but only because I stopped for supper. Because I stopped running long enough to see what was right in front of me. Charlotte felt tears pricking at her eyes. Oh, Thomas. I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly. I just wanted you to know. This house, this future, it's here, if you ever want to share it. But even if you don't, knowing you has made me a better man. Made me want to build something real, not just chase fool's gold. Charlotte looked around the small cabin, imagining it with curtains at the windows, herbs drying from the rafters, children's laughter echoing off the walls. She'd come west seeking purpose, a place where she could make a difference. She'd found that in her work with Doc Mitchell, but she'd found something else too, something she hadn't even known she was looking for until this moment. She turned back to Thomas, who was watching her with such vulnerability in his eyes that it nearly broke her heart. You know, she said softly, when I first met you, I thought you were the most stubborn man I'd ever encountered. Thomas's face fell slightly. I'm trying to be less so. Don't, Charlotte said, stepping closer to him. That stubbornness is what brought you to my door with bleeding hands. It's what kept you coming back week after week, even after they healed. It's part of what I love about you. Thomas's eyes widened. What did you say? I said I love you, Thomas O'Malley. Your stubbornness, your determination, your kind heart that you try so hard to hide. She reached out and took his hands in hers, running her thumbs over the calluses and scars that told the story of his struggles. I love that you bought this house before you even knew if I felt the same way. That's exactly the kind of foolish, wonderful thing I'd expect from you. For a moment, Thomas seemed frozen, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Then, with a sound that was half laugh, half sob, he pulled her into his arms, holding her as if he'd never let go. Marry me, he whispered against her hair. Not today, not tomorrow, but when you're ready. Marry me and help me make this house a home. Charlotte pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. On one condition. Name it. You come in for supper regularly. Not just when your hands are bleeding. Thomas laughed, the sound rich and full. I think I can manage that. Then he kissed her, and Charlotte knew she'd found the challenge, the purpose, and the love she'd been seeking since she first headed west. They were married the following spring, when the mountains were turning green and wildflowers bloomed along the creek near their cabin. Doc Mitchell gave the bride away, beaming with paternal pride, and half of Idaho City turned out to celebrate the union of the stubborn miner and the determined nurse who'd healed more than just his hands. Thomas never struck another major gold vein, but it didn't matter. He used his initial find to start a small construction business, building houses and businesses for the town as it began to grow again. Charlotte continued working with Doc Mitchell, eventually taking over his practice when he retired. Together, they built a life rich not in gold but in purpose and love. Years later, their front porch became a gathering place for their 3 children and, eventually, grandchildren. On summer evenings, Thomas would sit with Charlotte, their hands entwined, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, a different kind of treasure than the one he'd first sought, but infinitely more precious. Do you ever regret it? Charlotte asked one such evening, their grandchildren playing in the yard before them. Giving up gold mining for this? Thomas looked at her, at the silver threading through her chestnut hair, at the laugh lines around her still clear blue eyes, and shook his head. Never, he said, raising her hand to his lips. I found everything I was looking for the day you told me my hands would heal, but only if I stopped for supper. Charlotte smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder as the last rays of sun gilded the world around them in a light more valuable than all the gold in Idaho territory. Then I'm glad you were stubborn enough to keep coming back, she whispered. Always, Thomas promised. Always.